we'll start the day off, and the kids walk in, and we'll do an energizer of sorts. The first group will do a game. It could be Unangam Tunuu, like a counting, you look up at somebody, an elimination game.
On an Alaskan island called St. Paul, George Pletnikoff Junior is trying to revitalize his ancestors' language. The language is called Unangam Tunuu, and George teaches it to kids as an employee of the local tribal government.
We have an alphabet of sorts that we've put together. Say an A, so our alphabet, our focus is to start with sounds that are out here. So E, He, I, He, H. It's kind of where the sound is working our way into our mouth, into our lips, and then the use of our tongue down to our throat. You're going to go from E to H.
A little over 400 people live on St. Paul. It's in a chain called the Pribilof Islands, about 300 miles west of mainland Alaska. More than 80% of the community is Unangax, the native people who have lived here for centuries. And today, most people in St. Paul speak English at home. The number of fluent speakers of Unangam Tunuu is dwindling. By some estimates, there are only about 100 left. So George wants kids to get in touch with their roots, which often starts with games and songs.
Kind of the Frere Jacques. We have that in Unangam Tunuu. Kind of things for kids, and then we'll have one kind of traditional song. We're working these things back together, right?
George has dedicated himself to teaching and revitalizing Unangam Tunuu. He also performs traditional music and dance, but he is not a fluent speaker himself. George's first language is English. As a kid, he remembers hearing Unangam Tunuu around the house, but not too much.
So my parents would speak very minimally. They weren't fluent speakers. My grandparents, they wanted them to succeed in the American world. So for me, I would hear phrases and stuff growing up, and that would usually be at times that my parents didn't want me to know what they're talking about. So, little bits here and there.
For George, or anyone learning Unangam Tunuu, there is a valuable resource: audio recordings. Fluent speakers have recorded casual conversations, vocabulary lessons, and examples of games and songs. At work, George has access to archival recordings of fluent speakers conversing freely with each other.
I have a side focus here as part of my job is to transcribe them, which is oh man, I get burnt out so fast, because they were native speakers, they were fluent, and some things that sound like a mumble to me is like a full sentence to them.
I'm Jesse Johnston, and you're listening to Sound Files, a podcast about the preservation of recorded sounds supported by the National Recording Preservation Foundation. We're hoping this podcast offers our listeners a chance to hear some of the amazing stories preserved in audio, as well as meet some of the folks involved in helping to give us new ways to preserve and access these sounds. In this episode, we'll hear about a trove of recordings in Unangam Tunuu. In the 1970s and 80s, a teacher captured dozens of audio recordings of fluent speakers of this endangered language. Then, the tapes went into storage and were probably untouched for years. We'll hear from the man who recorded them, the oral history professor who digitized and shared them with the world, and how, with the help of audio recordings, George and other speakers of Unangam Tunuu are fighting to revitalize their language. Anyone with an internet connection can listen to the tapes that are known as the Cuttlefish Project. There are almost 60 reel-to-reel tapes, adding up to hours and hours of recordings. The man who recorded all of this wasn't a professional archivist, and he's not originally from Alaska. His name is Ray Hudson.
I'm a retired school teacher, initially first and second grades, and eventually high school art and high school Alaskan history.
Ray grew up in Washington State. He moved to Alaska in the 1960s. At the time, he was working on a philosophy degree in college, although he didn't really have a plan for how to use it. Then he heard about a town in Alaska that needed teachers.
And so I applied, and eventually they offered me first and second grades. And so I went off with a couple of boxes of lesson plans that my aunt supplied me, and I had 12 first and second graders. And I had, of course, no idea what to do apart from teaching them philosophy, which wasn't going to help them a lot.
Ray ended up in the town of Unalaska, in the Aleutian Islands. When you look at a map of Alaska, you'll see a long chain of islands stretching west, nearly reaching Russia. These are the Aleutians. The islands are mountainous, the product of volcanoes that ring the Pacific Ocean. According to Ray, there are no native trees in the Aleutians, only a few brought there by Russians or Americans.
So in a way, it's a very stark landscape, but in the summer, it's vibrantly green with hundreds of wildflowers, just extraordinarily beautiful. In the summer, there's a lot of mist. And in the wintertime, of course, we get some wonderful storms. The Aleutians are notorious for their storms, but the good weather is sort of a secret that we keep, and it's really quite lovely.
Ray got to Unalaska in 1964. As he settled in, he grew to like both the community and his teaching job. He also began researching the Aleutians and the people who lived there. One of the people he met was a woman in her 60s. She was originally from a different island a few hundred miles away and spoke English, Russian, and Unangam Tunuu, and she could read and write all three languages too. Ray started to pick her brain.
She warmed to me a bit and started answering a few questions I might have about the community. But she wanted me to write down what she said. She sort of enjoyed having me as a part-time recording secretary. And so I would sort of take notes. And when I asked if I could make a tape recording, she was hesitant because she said, if I record things, then you won't need me. I thought that was quite an interesting statement.
Ray did manage to make a few short audio recordings with her, but in 1973, the woman died. And Ray realized that the language and stories of this woman and people like her might not be around forever.
And by that time, I had been in the Aleutians for about 9 years. And so I'd seen a number of elders come and go. And so I guess it dawned on me that might be a good idea to try to record people. And so that's probably how I started doing it.
Ray also saw an opportunity for his students. By this point, he was teaching older kids, not just first and second graders. He brought Unangax elders into his classroom to interview them, to record them, and to get his students more engaged with their community. Because all of this happened almost 50 years ago, there are some details that have been lost to time. Like, where did Ray get a tape recorder? He thinks he started with a small cassette recorder and then upgraded to a reel-to-reel machine that he borrowed from someone in town. Also, where did the name Cuttlefish Project come from? Ray doesn't remember exactly, but he is positive about one thing. It wasn't his idea.
The students named it. It sort of came down to either fireweed or cuttlefish. And I'm not even sure we have cuttlefish in the Aleutians. But it's better than fireweed. So,
Starting in 1977, Ray brought in a series of speakers for the Cuttlefish Project. This class project, and the tape recordings that survive today, are a unique window into Unangax culture and the language Unangam Tunuu. Leslie McCartney, a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, says one tape is a vocabulary lesson.
They originally start off with like English words, like what's the word in Unangam Tunuu for bread? Water. And they're very Western-oriented foodstuffs. And then they go into the traditional foods, which I thought was really interesting.
Jam, uriniya, butter, maslach, crackers, sugarach, cookies, pranica, sugar, Sakura. Tea.
Leslie would eventually lead the charge to preserve the tapes, which we'll get to in a little bit. In one of her favorite recordings, you hear two men talking to Ray's students in a mixture of languages. There's a younger man who speaks English, and his uncle, who apparently does not.
You introduce him in the class, and he speaks in Unangam Tunuu, and then someone is translating. And it's a wonderful recording in that he speaks in Unangam Tunuu, it's translated back, and then you ask him questions, Ray, and he answers, but then the children start to ask questions. And they ask the questions in English, they're translated into Unangam Tunuu, but he would only answer back mainly in his language, which I think is a really wonderful treasure of a recording.
The men made the frame, and in the early days they used sea lion.
Beyond the Unangam Tunuu language, the Cuttlefish tapes document unique details of life in the Aleutians and some important historical information.
Was it, any sea lion skin or male sea lion?
During World War II, Japan attacked Alaska and took dozens of Unangax people as prisoners. In response, the U.S. government relocated more than 800 from the Aleutians and the other islands to mainland Alaska. This was devastating. Almost 100 people died in the relocation camps. And when survivors returned home, many of them found that American forces had burned their homes so the Japanese couldn't use them. In 1988, the federal government passed a law giving reparations to survivors. It also established a trust fund for Unangax communities. Several years before the bill passed, Ray recorded testimony from the survivors, which he thinks fills an important part of the historical record. And there's other important cultural information too. Leslie points to a recording of two women talking.
So the older woman is definitely speaking in Unangam Tunuu, and the younger woman is translating. And they're talking about how they used to use sea lion stomachs for bags and how many dried salmon they could fit into these stomachs of these sea lions. And the younger woman obviously speaks Unangam Tunuu very fluently, but the older woman keeps correcting her on pronunciation. And so she's trying very hard to pronounce it as she's being corrected.
Ray's project filled dozens of reel-to-reel tapes, some of them hours long. Taken together, the Cuttlefish recordings add up to an impressive archive with cultural and linguistic significance. Ray says at the time, he didn't have such lofty goals.
Well, I mean, in the moment, I mean, there was one class I taught out of many during the day, and so I was probably doing other things. So no, there was no attempt to make a coherent archive.
Besides his day job teaching, Ray has written several books and many journal articles about life in the Aleutians. He and his students also published some material from the Cuttlefish Project, but he says there's something special about hearing the voices in these tapes.
There's a kind of immediate accuracy in listening to a recording that you don't get from a transcript because of the intonations, just the whole pattern of the voice. And so I think people in the future that listen to a recording are going to get a sense of how important certain things were to people in a previous time.
The final recording from the Cuttlefish Project dates to 1982. Ray kept working in Unalaska schools for years after that. Then in the early 1990s, he retired and moved away, and he didn't give much thought to what would happen to all those tapes.
So I just put them in a cabinet, and you never know what will happen because, one librarian goes, a new one comes along and sees these old boxes of stuff and tosses them out. But fortunately, they sent them up to the university, and that was fantastic.
How exactly the Cuttlefish tapes changed hands is a mystery. This is the part where Leslie McCartney comes into the picture. Leslie is the curator of the oral history program at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. She's been there since 2012. Her collection includes materials from all over Alaska. There's a vault that's temperature and humidity controlled, and all she knows is that the Cuttlefish tapes ended up in that vault before her time. They had a tag indicating that they were accessioned, that is, formally accepted into the collection in 1997.
They could have arrived 3 years before that, 5 years before that. They could have arrived in 1997. There's no paperwork to say. So obviously somebody, I would say, was cleaning out the cupboard that Ray used to have and called the university or just shipped them up, and they were taken in.
For years and years, the only way to hear the Cuttlefish tapes would be to go to Fairbanks, make your way to the library, find the right room in the basement, and hope that an employee could set you up with the reel-to-reel machine. And that was assuming you even knew they existed.
So, did they get used? I would say probably they've never been off the shelf.
But a few years ago, the fate of those tapes began to change. Leslie had an opportunity for grant funding from the National Recording Preservation Foundation. One of Leslie's colleagues tipped her off about the Cuttlefish tapes. As Leslie learned what was on the tapes, she also saw that time had been kind to them.
To the seeing eye, there was no mold on the tapes. They looked like they were in great shape. As you know, you don't really know until you start playing magnetic media if it's dry shed syndrome or other problems with the tape, but they looked physically good. And really, because of the importance of them, not to say others are not important, they're all important, it's in our collection, I really wanted them professionally done.
In 2020, the National Recording Preservation Foundation awarded a grant to digitize the Cuttlefish recordings. Leslie worked with a company called Mass Productions, which handled the technical work. The university also uploaded the files to their library catalog and made them free to access. The Cuttlefish Project went from a stack of tapes in a basement that probably nobody had ever heard to an online database that anyone around the world can find.
We run pretty well on almost a very, very low budget, if any budget. We have very small staff, and we're not sound engineers. We're not experts in preservation, sound recording. We do what we can. But when I see really precious recordings like this, I want them done professionally because they are so important linguistically and cultural heritage wise. We want the best we can possibly do.
There was one other factor that made the Cuttlefish tapes a success. It wasn't just the moments they captured, or the fact that the tapes weren't moldy. It was also because of Ray. As Leslie dug into the tapes, she reached out to Ray. Decades after the fact, he still remembered crucial details about the people whose voices he had recorded. Details that Leslie couldn't have discovered any other way.
When you go to write a preservation grant for any particular audio, one of the questions is like, well, why is this important? What's the big deal? Why is this important as opposed to something else? Ray's the context expert, and who was also able to give me short biographies of many of the people that occur on the recordings. And I was able to use a lot of that information in the narrative for the grant application too, which proves why these recordings are important.
According to linguists that Leslie consulted, today there are probably fewer than 200 speakers of Unangam Tunuu. Some estimates are even lower, about 100 or less. On St. Paul Island, the home of George Pletnikoff Junior, there is only one surviving fluent speaker. It's George's uncle, who is in his mid-80s. George tries to strike up conversations in Unangam Tunuu, but as a non-native speaker, George speaks differently than fluent speakers, and that makes it tough.
A big focus we do have in this revitalization effort is to speak in the full way, like not abbreviating things. We have the cannot to the can't kind of thing, happening in language, and we want to say cannot in Unangam Tunuu, and that's not always receivable to people like my uncle, you know. So if I try to say something else, you know, it's either unclear, you know, or I'm saying it in a way that he's not familiar with.
Hundreds of years ago, before contact with the Western world, Unangam Tunuu had tens of thousands of native speakers. There were even 9 different dialects. As Russians took control of Alaska, they inflicted violence on indigenous peoples. Unangam Tunuu and every aspect of Unangax culture began to change. When the United States bought Alaska, English became dominant. Children learned English in school, not Unangam Tunuu. And, as was the case for indigenous Americans across the United States, some Unangax kids were sent to boarding schools and forced to assimilate. Today, of those 9 dialects, only 2 remain. So, George sees any recording of fluent Unangam Tunuu as a prized possession.
It's a way to maintain that purity of how the language is developed and how it's spoken, because, you know, we have our American accents now and we're losing our sense of being able to pronounce things in a way that it's clear, and how our ancestors developed this language. Each speaker from a generation and from a village, you know, had their way of speaking that we can just kind of weave together. And, you know, I mean, we have a dictionary from a lot of these things.
George says that it can feel like the Unangax people are scattered. There are people who have moved to the mainland. Others have gone to the lower 48. But he sees revitalizing language as a tool that can bring Unangax people together no matter where they are.
What I see is just a unification. Is something that I really hope for, and for our language, you know, is something that we all do identify with. We heard those things from my parents, from my grandparents, you know, they do bring us together. To be able to just hear these sounds.
That's a big project, bigger than just George, and it's ongoing. Other Unangax people are also working to revitalize the language and other cultural traditions. In the meantime, George is starting small. He uses Unangam Tunuu in his own house with his kids.
You know, a daughter's going on 3 and a 2-month-old now, and, you know, even though she's, you know, we speak English mostly, but, you know, she gets more Unangam Tunuu than I did growing up, you know. So to be able to give that focus is to foster a sense of, you know, at least a foundation of language within this next generation of kids, that it's almost, you know, some second nature.
And when George's kids are old enough, they will have the Cuttlefish Project as a resource. Leslie, the professor who preserved the recordings, takes the long view. She hopes that the work she does today pays off decades from now. And the Cuttlefish tapes are not the only place to hear fluent Unangam Tunuu.
The more context that I can have around a collection, why was it recorded, who recorded it, what was the context of the recordings, it brings life to just having a bunch of recordings, right? It will let people, you know, in long when I'm gone and Ray's gone, they can come back and look at these biographies that Ray has created, short biographies of these people, to understand who they were.
Even though Ray ended up with a treasure trove of recordings, he insists that he didn't know how valuable they were at the time. Now, he wants more people to carry on this work. Every person and every individual experience contributes to the mosaic of Unangax culture. There are still plenty of stories that haven't been recorded, and cultural knowledge in danger of being forgotten.
People think of elders as being only, I don't know how to say this, you know, ancient and from a different culture kind of thing. But there are remarkable individuals who are now in their 60s and 70s, who are the age of the people that we recorded in the Cuttlefish Project, who have been very important to the history of their people. And to record these people would be invaluable and give people in the future great insights into what was happening at the time it happened.
So how can you tell what's valuable? And how do you know what will be useful to people in the future? Archivists call this process appraisal. But Ray says that in the moment it may not be clear. The Cuttlefish recordings, though, show what can happen when you ask questions, listen, and find a way to preserve what you hear.
And I often think, the work that we do today, just like you, Ray, didn't realize the importance of the work you were doing. Sometimes we don't see the value. I mean, we see the value of what we're doing, but we don't see that really important thing. And I like to think that, in 100 years, someone will say, boy, I'm so glad that person made this collection or recorded these people.
The Sound Files podcast is presented by the National Recording Preservation Foundation, an independent nonprofit established by the Library of Congress, and generous support from the University of Michigan School of Information. Learn more or make a donation at recordingpreservation.org. The senior producer and editor is Teresa Carey, with writer Jacob Pinter and sound engineer Steve Lack, with original music by Evan Haywood. I'm Jesse Johnston, creator of Sound Files and a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Information. Remember, every sound tells a story, so let's keep preserving them.